Hello for the week. I am here to talk about issues of sex and dementia this week, and are they compatible? In particular, right, we're looking at the issue of consent and abuse and that tricky issue of when to protect and when to promote autonomy to its fullest. So, we've been dancing around this topic for a couple of weeks as we talked about long-term care last week, and several of you are bringing up these issues spontaneously in the discussion board. Way to go. And a lot of you from your experience in long-term care have seen some of these issues transpire when one resident or the other may have dementia, may be deemed to lack capacity to make decisions, and something of an intimate or sexual nature might happen. Everybody throws up their arms, runs around screaming, metaphorically, and doesn't know what to do. Because as we talked about before, there is a complete lack of policy and procedures to follow when these issues happen. And most people just want to sweep this under the rug and put out fires instead of making some kind of statement or policy about what to do, unfortunately. So let's advance here. So what we're really talking about fundamentally, when we talk about these issues of when to protect in sex and dementia, is we're balancing the two issues of autonomy and risk, as you can see here. So we want to promote as much autonomy as possible, showing the independence of the resident, their ability to affect their own care, to make their own decisions, to exercise their rights. And we're always balancing this on the other side with risk, right? How much risk is there? How can we keep the residents safe? And what's the liability here? Or the potential for more risk or risk and harm? So this isn't an easy task, right? I mean, all of us have had to do this in some level for ourselves, for other people, if you've had kids of your own, or you've worked in a setting where you're in charge of others, and you have to decide, well, is this in their best interest? Are they making good decisions here? And how much am I willing to let them go, right? Am I willing to let them jump off the roof of the house and test out their new cape? Maybe that's too much risk, right? So we'll back off a little on the autonomy, and we'll say, well, you can jump off the three steps on the front porch and see if you make it. The risk a little bit less, right, than jumping off the roof of the house. This is just a sort of symbolic or an example of the decisions we make to help people to boost as much autonomy as possible while still considering the risk. All right, so some questions to consider here. Always when we're looking at these issues of trying to help others make decisions or butting in on decision making of other people, we need to ask ourselves, when is this paternalism? When am I butting in because really what the reality is I disagree with you, or I think I know better? As opposed to there's actually a real risk here, your inability to make a decision this complex. You don't have the mental wherewithal or the capabilities to do that. So how many of you think that when in an institutional setting, when we are making decisions for residents, that it's most often in their best interest and because they can't make their own decisions? I should, if you were here in class, not see a lot of hands raised and hear some crickets. Unfortunately, what happens a lot in institutional settings that are very much about that medical model of care and keeping everyone safe at all costs and keeping liabilities down is paternalism tends to rule the day. And this is the case also with families, right, of residents. So we tend to think we know better. I disagree with you, therefore I think your judgment is poor. If you're a parent, most of you have had parents in your lives, if not all of you. This is a common struggle. Think of the adolescent, think of the willful child trying to get some autonomy back here, and willful in a good way, right? Exercising autonomy. This is the same idea. So what we want people to do when they're in the situation where they may be directing care for an individual is step back and ask, how much of this is just, I disagree? And shouldn't I be allowing you to make decisions that, are an acceptable or potentially limited level of risk? And I've said this before in this class, but the second question here, should older adults be able to have the same freedom to make bad decisions as all other ages? The answer here is yes, absolutely, right? So when we look across the lifespan and, through parenting and independence, gaining your own, becoming partnered potentially, and having limits on your decision-making, all the way into older adulthood and having your older children kind of infringe upon your own decision-making, shouldn't you be able to have the same freedom to make bad decisions as everyone else? And when does that? So where's that line of this is just a bad decision, they need to reap those consequences, that's an acceptable level of risk, to, wow, this is a real risk, it's out of bounds risk, and it really is indicative of this person's inability to make their own decisions. So repeated and egregious bad judgment to a level of putting yourself at a significant risk certainly needs to be stepped in upon, and some supports added so that potentially you can gain back a little bit of that autonomy at a more acceptable level of risk. But those are some questions that are really important. Is this just paternalism? Shouldn't I be, is this bad judgment on your part? Fine, but is this bad judgment to the point of you not being able to exercise good judgment ever? Or is it just, we disagree? Okay. So when we bring these questions into the arena of sexual expression, in particular in a long-term care setting, because this is oftentimes where we see these issues arise, is when an individual has dementia or some other related disease that has caused them cognitive impairment. People start to question, can you make your own decisions? And certainly if a sexual situation arises in a nursing home, they're quick to ask, is this person able to make their own sexual decisions? And usually the answer is no, regardless of the information gathering or evidence, right? So what is consent? Well, sexual consent is just very simply your ability to make a non-coerced voluntary decision about your sexual life. So being able to have the knowledge, so these are the legal considerations, being able to have the knowledge about what kind of activity is involved here. Yes, we're talking about sex, so oftentimes when we talk about sexual consent and confusion, when someone is just kissing you, is that kissing, or do you think that's sex, or do you think that sex is just kissing? Are you confusing activities? Do you understand what you're engaging in or what's being asked of you? There's also rationality or reason in the legal definition of sexual consent. Do you have the mental ability to sort of reason through this decision of whether or not to engage in these activities? Can you weigh the risks and the benefits and say, yeah, I still want to do that? And very importantly, is this voluntary? So these three things are present in just about every state law on sexual consent that you can find. Some states add a fourth clause of morality, which is an interesting thing in and of itself. And a lot of times when you look at the actual cases that come through, the morality clause is kind of thrown out as something irrelevant. But some states do have this sense that the person has to understand the moral implications of the activity that they're doing. So, what are the moral implications of all these activities? And is that a concrete thing that we can define and then adjudicate in a legal system? That's a much more important question. But these three are really the bread and butter of consent law. So from a legal standpoint, if you're able to demonstrate these three things, then technically you have the ability to consent to sexual activity or the activity in question. So that is consent. Now, abuse would be any type of non-consensual sexual behavior. Non-consenting sexual contact of any kind is characterized as abuse. So interestingly, we don't know that much about sexual abuse in older adults in general. And when I say we don't know that much about it, we don't know how much is happening. We don't know the prevalence. We don't know the incidence rates of abuse because the way that they're reported and the statistics that are kept are very unreliable. So there are different types of abuse, right, that are reported to like an adult protective services organization. So that would be the place, if you don't know, where if a case of abuse is happening, you can make an anonymous or non-anonymous report to report the incident, and you can also report it to the police. But Adult Protective Services is one way to go, and then they follow through and investigate, or hopefully follow through and investigate the evidence of abuse in that situation. So sexual abuse isn't often reported in these cases in older adults. In fact, when sexual abuse is alleged or suspected, responders to that situation, whether it be a medical professional, a caregiver, a legal professional, right, like police, they rarely ask the right questions. We find that would help take the necessary and appropriate steps to assist abuse victims. So this is pretty concerning. When we look at the very, very, very few, there's 2 that we know of, studies that report any kind of prevalence of sexual abuse. And this is just in older adults. This isn't in nursing homes per se. But it's about at 0.2 to 0.6% of the population. So 2 in every 1,000 or 6 in every 1,000 older adults, which is very low comparatively to other age groups and what we suspect is happening in actual situations. So of course in all abuse, it's going to be a lower level of reporting, right? So people are hesitant to report for a lot of reasons. But unfortunately, it looks like when reports are made, even alleged reports are made and investigated, very few of these cases are getting prosecuted or taken forward or handled in what would be considered a competent manner to fully flesh out if actual abuse is happening. So that's on the flip side, right? So in this class, I've been very pro-sexuality, sexual expression. Let's get rid of the fetters of ageism and let older adults be the sexual beings they are. And that needs to be balanced, as always, with safety and protection of vulnerable people, of truly vulnerable people, in which there are some among older adults, right? So we probably have all met older adults in our lives, among other age groups, that are vulnerable and need to be protected. So it's not just the case of being an advocate and promoting sexual expression for all older adults. It is being an advocate and balancing that with a healthy understanding of risk and the need to promote safety, which is a lot of times why we see this backpedal and complete backlash of nursing homes toward that protective, oh my God, there's risk there. We need to protect this person at all costs and protect ourselves from liability. So that's my little aside there on sexual abuse among older adults and the fact that we need to be cognizant that that is something to be protected against. There are several different types of perpetrators of sexual abuse, right? There's care providers, caregivers, other older adults themselves, people who are cognitively intact or not, potentially maybe abusing another older adult, older or family members, etc. Could all be perpetrators of sexual abuse against an older adult. So I want to talk a little bit more about on the consent side. So when we're figuring out when to protect, right? So the big question is when to protect. When should we protect this person, right? Again, we need to consider, well, what is consent? How do we know if they're able to consent? So this is the legal side of the coin. And there are some other practical and ethical considerations that we have to take into account as providers and people who work with older adults. So is sexual consent capacity a black and white, yes or no, dichotomous type of concept? My best answer is no, or it depends. And is it global? Is it all or nothing? Can you consent to everything or nothing? And that is absolutely no, right? We know that consent is a domain game. You can be found to lack capacity to consent to medical decisions, but be able to sign your own checks still and drive. There are all kinds of different capacities, and it's not one global determination made by one cognitive screener used in one nursing home setting. It doesn't work like that. It's not that simple. So the bottom line there being, it's not this black and white, yes or no, always or never issue. There's a lot of area in between. Another consideration that we need to take is in this yes or no, all or nothing world, we tend to then move towards behaviors like abstinence, which if you look at this from sort of a comparison to substance abuse, no more sex, no more intimacy, akin to absolutely no more alcohol, right? So we take a very abstinence-only view once we have a sniff that they can't consent to sexual behavior or that they might be demented. As opposed to taking more of a harm reduction approach. So what do I mean by harm reduction? Those of you in the substance abuse world, you'll know this well, but harm reduction is essentially that we don't take this at all or nothing abstinence only viewpoint. We say, well, maybe a little bit of alcohol is okay. So, well, maybe a little bit of risk is okay. Maybe holding hands and kissing is okay, but intercourse isn't. So that's more of a harm reduction approach where we look at different intimate and sexual behaviors on a continuum, and that's what I mean. So on a risk continuum. So no risk to absolutely crazy amount of risk over here. Where is the behavior that I'm seeing at? How much risk is actually involved? And that directly should map back onto how complex a decision is this, and does this person need to have sexual consent capacity to be able to engage in this behavior if it's low enough risk. And also, I want you to challenge you to think about voluntariness. So back to this. Voluntariness, the ability to make a choice and voice that choice. A lot of times people who are in the nursing home may not be able to give you a straight yes or no answer. They may not be verbal anymore. They may be in and out of being able to be verbal. But volition, as opposed to voluntariness, is if you're not able to voice a decision and say, yes, Dr. Syme, I would like to be sexual, then what do your behaviors show me? Are you happy when you engage in this behavior? Are you showing that you want to be close to this individual in your behaviors? Or on the flip side, are you having more anxiety-driven behaviors? Do I see hiding and scared emotions and different types of negative behaviors that they're showing, like behavioral problems after engaging in this? So those would be indicators that something is wrong and you are not happy with what's going on. And it may be that that's an indicator that you don't want to do this, or this is something that's not comfortable for you. So in those cases, we take those behaviors as an indication of your voluntariness, or we can. So for those of you who are interested, I wanted to give you this resource in case it's useful for you down the road as you work in long-term care, come across older adults that have these issues in your practice or in your workplace. When we talk about sexual consent capacity, there's not a lot of tools out there to help us determine this. And part of the reason is because it is very difficult to determine, right? There are a lot of different factors that go into it. But there are some tools to help you kind of reason through or help a team work through whether or not the evidence is showing that this behavior is able to be supported at an okay level of risk. One of the early and only assessment clinical interview tools that we have is by Lichtenberg and Strzelepek. Back in 1990, they developed a co-ed dementia unit, and after they had so many instances of these sexual or intimate expressions, they decided they need something to help them out and help the team out. And this is very much a clinical interview, evidence from the team, gathering all this information and making an interdisciplinary decision as a team in a care plan kind of tool. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in it, to look up particularly Lichtenberg 2014, which has a sort of longer description of some of the questions that go into this. But essentially, you're asking three different areas. Is the patient aware of the relationship, which gets back to this understanding or knowledge issue? Can the patient avoid exploitation, mapping back to voluntariness? And is the patient aware of the risks involved or the sexual risks? So this, again, maps back to rationality or reason. And this is part of a more comprehensive assessment of what behaviors are happening, what is their physical and cognitive health, their mental health, all of those are in the same package. All right, so this particular assessment tool is given to us by the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority on supporting sexual health and intimacy in care facilities. For those of you who haven't seen this, I will say that I have this right here listed in the resources, and you can Google this and you will come up with it, and it is sort of a workbook tool of how to address some of these more sticky sexual issues. And they take a very team approach to this too, which is important when we're thinking about when to protect. We need to gather information from all different sources. The direct care workers who are observing behaviors, director of nursing who's getting reports, social worker who may have interviewed or have background information on social and psychological issues, psychologist if you have one on board, everybody, rec therapist, everybody on board who has observed some of these behaviors in this situation needs to have input. So what kind of data do you gather when you're in a nursing home setting? You're trying to decide, when do we need to protect this person? You want to look at the behaviors. What's going on? What kind of risk is involved in the behavior that's happening? Do I see, happy resident after this? Are they hiding? Are they combative? Are they starting to have very negative behaviors? Those types of things. You want a description of the behavior involved, including those things, how they were behaving before, how they're behaving now. To address their consent, you could use a tool like Lichtenberg and Strzelepek. You certainly do not want to use a tool like a brief cognitive screener that is a global dichotomous tool. Just use that to assess consent. You might want to have use that Lichtenberg and Strzelepek clinical tool, or develop clinical questions of your own. There's also a recent article by Jennifer Hellman in the Clinical Gerontologist, where she gives a nice set of 10 to 15 questions that help interview about sexual consent. And you also want to have that team meeting where you gather all of this information together, talk to each other about this, and make a decision as a team. Again, on that risk continuum, where's the behavior? Is it closer to the lower risk, closer to the super high risk? And decide, how can we mitigate risk if it's up here? what behaviors can we allow? How can we move the risk further down and support the autonomy of the individual as much as possible? Maybe it's down to we separate them at night, but we allow them to be together during the day, or someone, it needs to be around or aware in case someone's physically frail and might need support. You may need to change the types of behaviors, reinforce different intimate behaviors, add in other types of behaviors, and we've seen this in homes before, such as reinforcing touch and social connection in other ways that may not be sexual, but sort of fulfill this need for intimacy or closeness or social closeness with others if it's just too risky to allow other types of behaviors. So there's a lot of things you can do in a care plan to be able to meet intimacy needs of an individual at an acceptable level of risk while supporting as much autonomy as possible. All right. So some more resources for you. This is Dr. Dole's book on sexuality and long-term care, and there's a section in there on consent and developing policy around sexual expression and long-term care and consent, talking about when to protect. There's also, we've talked about this right in this class, the Hebrew Home at Riverdale has the one and only well-known published sexual consent, sexual expression policies in the U.S. for nursing homes, and this is readily available at the website down there. And you can use it, you can replicate it, it's public domain. And here's a couple of others that we've talked about before. For those of you who work in a long-term care setting and are interested in education and training, the Freedom of Sexual Expression is a DVD that has been found useful for staff trainings for people talking about sex and sexual expression in long-term care settings. And just a reminder, right, that we have very few people with policies, and we tend to then default to more paternalistic ways of dealing with these issues in nursing homes and doing what I agree with and because I disagree with you versus what is in the best interest of the resident and what is in line with what they would want at an acceptable level of risk. So last minute pitch here for the doing no harm, which is a part of most professional ethical codes and is part of managing risk. So we can do no harm in long-term care settings and also allow intimacy and limit intimacy, right? But not prohibit intimacy. That is also doing harm, right? Because intimacy is a need for every individual, no matter who you are, what age you are, what setting you live in. So doing no harm doesn't mean prohibiting intimacy. It just means that there may need to be limits on that at an acceptable level of risk, or it may mean allowing whatever is going on and being able to be comfortable with the acceptable level of risk that is there and not eliminating all risk. Because as I said before, sex is not and intimacy are not risk-free for anybody. There's always some amount of risk involved. So if we're trying to get rid of it, then we're trying to get rid of sex. So acceptable levels, that's what we're aiming for. Okay, that's my soapbox for this week. And if you have questions, please do email me. The online ongoing discussion number 2, which has been open now about myths and positive and negative myths and stereotypes about older adults, is still ongoing till the end of this week. At the beginning of next week, Sunday night, Monday morning, I'm going to post the final ongoing discussion. And because it's a short week, it's a short ongoing discussion, you only have to post a couple of times in it, and it'll be a more summative experience. about the course and the things that you've learned. So that will happen the last week. Please do email me with any questions about your final projects. There's an online chat happening tomorrow, if you're watching this video after I post it, Thursday from 6 to 7 p.m. And if you can't make this final online chat and you still have to participate in one, again, just a reminder to email me the times that you are available in the last week. So an example might be, well, I can't make it, but I'm available all mornings until noon, Monday through Friday next week, or I'm only available after 6 p.m., but every weekday next week. So I'm going to try to get everybody possible in. So definitely try to make this one if you can. Several of you indicated you could, but if you can't, you need to email me and let me know what times you're available so that I can make sure to get everybody in. I think that's about it for cleanup here, and I will see you next week.